Welcome to Hiraeth, the home of modern Welsh politics. We have just finished a major week in Welsh politics, with the race to succeed Mark Drakeford coming to an end and the UK COVID inquiry's Welsh evidence sessions completing. But it is the latter we will mainly focus on today. Many weeks of cross-examination have just concluded, where senior figures in the Welsh Government were asked to justify decisions being made during the pandemic, as well as justify why messaging app WhatsApp seemed to be the forum for many of those decisions. Concerns still remain about why there is no Wales-specific COVID inquiry, and now it seems unlikely that there will be one. Why are decisions made in Wales not being scrutinised in Wales? Arguably, the most scrutinous of scrutineers has been and will be Wales Online's Welsh Affairs editor and good friend of the pod, Will Hayward. As author of Lockdown Wales, he is no stranger to COVID events in Wales, and we're delighted to have Will joining us today. Hello, Will. How are you?
Hi, thanks for having me.
Well, as we said at the top, there is no Wales-specific COVID inquiry, with the few weeks of scrutiny being just simply one module of a larger UK COVID inquiry. Give everyone a bit of context here. Why was the decision taken to not have a Wales-specific inquiry? And conversely, why was the decision taken in Scotland to have one on Scottish issues?
So I think, well, ultimately the reason why there was no Welsh COVID inquiry is because Mark Drakeford didn't want to have one. That's it. His choice was that we are not going to have a Welsh COVID inquiry. Now, the reason why he chose not to have one is that he said that it is impossible to understand the decisions that were taken in Wales without understanding the UK context. So, and that was a point that himself and many of his ministers tried to make throughout the inquiry while it was in Cardiff, was that decisions made in London were affecting the decisions they could make here. Scotland is also part of the UK inquiry, but is also having their own inquiry. Now, I wouldn't say I'm an expert on Welsh politics, on Scottish politics, but what I would say is you can't really be a Scottish National Party saying we need to leave the UK and then leaving the scrutiny of their decision-making to a UK-wide inquiry. But by the same token, Mark Drakeford's an advocate for home rule. He wants to get as close to independence as you can without actually being independent. And I think that to then decide, actually, no, we're not going to have a Welsh-specific inquiry that can look in detail at decisions made in Wales, in my view, is a bit short-sighted. I think it's not been perceived very well, but that's the decision-making and the thought process behind the choice.
Obviously, I get the sense that you don't feel that Welsh issues are receiving enough attention in this inquiry, but do you think that whilst they are being looked at, they're receiving a sufficient level of scrutiny?
I don't think anyone can watch that COVID inquiry and not think that the issues they are looking at are really forensically been picked through. The quality of the questioning, the level of detail that they go into, the amount of documents they've clearly looked at is incredible. The issue is that they have limited time. They had 12 days, which is fewer than Scotland and far, far fewer than England for this particular module. I was sat in the chamber for the opening day, and Baroness Hallett, the chair, acknowledged that there was a desire in Wales for a specific inquiry and said that we're not going to be able to look at every issue in Wales, but we'll look at the biggest issues. But actually, when you're looking at something like COVID, there's a lot of big issues, aren't there? So just looking at 2 or 3 very big issues means that there's a lot which really matters and is really important and affected a lot of people that won't be looked at. But I will say that the level of scrutiny that the inquiry does of the things it is looking at is very, very good.
So, Will, you obviously wrote your book, Lockdown Wales, about the pandemic. What were your major takeaways during that writing process about the way that Wales works? And do you think that this is playing out in sufficient detail during these evidence sessions?
Yeah, so my book looked at the first wave. At the time, I was really hoping it was just the only wave. I was just hoping it was COVID, but it turns out that wasn't correct. Looking at all of the pandemic as a whole, I think the thing that jumped out again and again through the inquiry is how it's possible to be simultaneously really, really surprised and really shocked, and also completely unsurprised. Like, it's shocking what you were hearing, but actually weirdly unsurprising because we lived through it. And actually, a lot of the things that you assumed that there was a plan. You assumed it wasn't as chaotic behind the scenes as it looked. So you thought, well, it's just the impression we're getting. But actually, it was chaos. I mean, some of the the messages between special advisors and Welsh Government ministers. I mean, we don't have a lot of them because apparently the only thing to qualify you to be a politician in the UK is just be really bad at looking after your WhatsApps, because that's the only thing they all seem to have in common. I don't know anyone else who's ever lost their WhatsApps except for every single politician who apparently has managed to do it, which is quite impressive. But I think it was very, very evident covering it, because I was in the UK government lobby and I was in the Welsh government lobby, and the approaches, even though often they were drawing from the same data sets, were quite different. And even just, I suppose in a way, the administrations mirrored the people at the top of it. The Welsh administration mirrored Mark Drakeford, and the UK government one mirrored Boris Johnson.
Like you mentioned there, the WhatsApp messages, Will, and that is, it seems to be a failure in every UK administration. But what was the importance of those WhatsApp messages? Do you think it was a fuss about nothing, or do we think there are things in there which we really should have had available to the inquiries?
Yeah, so I mean, the reason that they lost them, depending on who you spoke to, Jeremy Miles lost them because he'd lost his phone previously, so he turned on deleting WhatsApps. Vaughan Gething lost his when he changed phones, and Mark Drakeford apparently doesn't even use it. He used it 11 times. But I think the important, and he was very dismissive as well, Mark Drakeford. He was very dismissive of any importance being placed on this, and the fact that they were using them, he didn't think was an issue. He said it was against the rules, but the rules were the problem because they were made in 2009, which was actually before WhatsApp actually was invented. But I think the biggest illustration of the issue with using WhatsApp came from a group of special advisors. So there was a special advisors group, so SPADs, for each of the different ministers, and they were having conversations about all sorts of stuff that was going on, and we might come on to it. I mean, special advisors had a hell of a lot of power in the Welsh government during COVID, but they were talking about different things. So one of them would say, there's an outbreak at a meatpacking factory in Anglesey, and the head of the council would like some help. And then someone else would come in and say, well, let me know if you want me to make a call. And then someone else would say, oh, have you seen this article about Adam Price? And then someone else would take the mickey out of that article. And then someone else would say, do we need any more scientists? Because we actually haven't, there's not that many scientists in Wales, and I'm just bothering the same few people. But then the next statement would be, does anyone have a link to that Zoom meeting? Which I think we all did about 1,000 times, didn't we, during the pandemic? But there was loads of really important things there. There was an outbreak in Anglesey, and there was a shortage of scientists. And from what you can see from that, these things were not actioned. They were not properly recorded. They weren't minuted. There was no process underpinning it. And there's a reason why we use formal processes. There's no reason why we have proper meetings, which are minuted, and there's a clear order of doing things, because in a chaotic situation, it's actually more important to be organized and not have some things done on informal channels. I can totally understand people using WhatsApp messages in order to support each other and to ask for things like links to meetings. But if you are going to start making decisions in those forums, which the Welsh Government denied that they did, but ultimately discussions about decisions were had in those forums, if you're going to do that, you have to keep them. You still have to have to keep a record of them for posterity, for lesson learning, and for accountability.
Do you think that those WhatsApp messages that we've got available to us should be published so we can see what was there?
Yeah, in principle, I think if someone is a special advisor, for example, and they're doing their job, and they might have had quite personal discussions on there, and I think there needs to be some kind of screening to make sure that personal details and the insights in someone's personal life aren't being put out into the public domain just completely unfiltered, especially if ultimately they've given them to the inquiry. They've given that information, and I think treating that with a certain degree of respect is important. But I think the threshold for what is kept out should be pretty high. So I think the principle should be everything goes out unless there is a good reason to not include it, would be my opinion.
So the whole thing around setups, which have disappearing messages after a few months, and that kind of fear of security breach or leaks, really isn't justifiable to have that kind of thing when we're talking around things like this, or even wider policy areas, really.
Yeah, I could understand if you had disappearing WhatsApps on, and then something happened very suddenly, and then you hadn't taken that off. But we knew months and months before disappearing WhatsApps could even possible to be introduced that there was going to be an inquiry into this. We knew about a week into lockdown that this was going to be an inquiry. We knew that this was a situation of generational significance. And let's face it, I would be surprised if a motivation underpinning the removal of those WhatsApps was not motivated by the idea of wanting to prevent accountability, frankly. And it doesn't mean that people were lying when they said they did this, but when they said that they lost WhatsApps, etc. But I think it's pretty fishy, isn't it, that every single person seems to not have the WhatsApps from a certain period of time.
Yeah, I think it was quite interested in this because I worked in that environment, and you are supposed to record everything. And even before WhatsApp, I don't think everything was. And even for these inquiries, I'd be surprised if things like telephone calls and things like that, which were discussed, were any kind of record or note was put for those. But one of the really interesting things that came out of it was some of the kind of conversations between people. And one of the messages was between Eluned Morgan and Rebecca Evans about asking for clarity on the rules. Were you surprised by that revelation that even Welsh Government ministers at one point did not seem to know the rules during the pandemic?
I wasn't surprised because they were quite complicated. Like, a key part of my job every 3 weeks was to go through the new rules and try and make them accessible for our readers. And it was quite hard, especially because people's lives are complicated. So, especially, like, for instance, the amount of parents I had who had split from their partners and had kids half the time and wanted to know about being able to travel to take them to school or to pick them up, or they had to travel out during a local lockdown to take a kid to a club. And I think what I actually demonstrated for me was the difference between, if you are a lawmaker and you're in the room making those decisions, I think they underestimated how seriously a lot of people in Wales were taking it. Obviously, there were some people who just couldn't care less, but I think the vast majority of people in Wales were really, really serious about following these rules, and they didn't just follow them because they didn't want to be seen as breaking the law. They saw the imperative of doing this because they were scared. They didn't want to be responsible for loss of life ultimately. And I think whereas politicians who were writing the rules would think, well, people will intuit from this, they'll be able to, if they make a mistake here or there, it's not a big deal. Whereas actually, when you're the person who could be fined, you're the person who could be labelled a criminal, you're going to feel a lot less secure about breaking those rules. And I actually don't think a lot of politicians realised how serious people were taking it and what they were actually imposing on people's lives. And that's not to say that they didn't understand the gravity of the situation they were in, but just that we saw it in Downing Street as well, didn't we? Laws, if you're making them, just don't seem to matter as much. And I'm not saying there was rule breaking from the Welsh Government either. I'm caveating a lot of this answer.
I think that's fine. I think it's the volume of information, and we're talking about politicians make these laws and rules, but behind that are huge volumes of written material from officials, which they've got to understand and absorb. And I just don't think that's understood outside that kind of bubble.
Yeah, I think it's weird, isn't it? Because I feel like I know the law in Wales, don't I? In Britain, I know, like, I can't look at my phone when I'm driving, but I don't know how that law is written, and I don't know how the exact specifics of how that's worded, or if there's any extenuating circumstances when I'm allowed to speed or something like that. I don't know any of that, but you inherently know it because over the decades of being alive, you absorb it through osmosis, don't you? But when suddenly huge parts of your life change in the space of 3 weeks, it's suddenly like, oh God, I don't know where I'm supposed to be at with this. So I think that was probably part of it, and it's why I was probably outside of the Welsh Government. I like to think one of the people who poured over those rules the most, and I still couldn't tell you all of them and know it off the top of my head. So I'm not surprised also that Welsh Government ministers struggled.
Well, let's turn to social care. So the Welsh Government notoriously took 13 days longer than England to mandate testing for those going into care homes. But how was this justified by the Welsh Government during the hearings?
Well, it depends on who you speak to, doesn't it? I think this was always going to be the area where they struggled the most because ultimately they screwed up. There's no getting away from the fact this was a massive mistake that they made. So it was the discharges from hospitals into care homes without a test. So people without symptoms were not tested. And Vaughan Gething's argument at the time was the advice says this is not a useful thing to do. He unequivocally said it was not about a lack of testing capacity. When I asked him about it in the start of May in 2020, he said even if it had 3 times the testing capacity, he would not have done those tests. He was then challenged about this during the inquiry and initially said that the reason for the difference between England and Wales was because England hadn't shared the information. But I mean, I went through the SAGE papers at the time. There was demonstrable evidence that asymptomatic transmission was possible. Rob Orford, who was the chief scientific officer, actually said that he'd never given that advice to the Welsh government. So that seemed to undermine Mr. Gething's testimony. But then Mark Drakeford, when he was there, said, well, actually, it's simply it was a lack of tests. We didn't have enough testing capacity to do it, which obviously also is different to what Vaughan Gething said. But all of that was different to what the chief medical officer, Sir Frank Atherton, said. In his evidence, he essentially said that this was a hard but albeit a decision, but they knew that the virus was going to get into care homes, and they believed that care homes would be able to manage it. That any infections in care settings should be able to be managed by following the guidance. Now, I took dozens and dozens of calls from care homes during that period, and they had no tests, they had no PPE, they were fighting a virus no one had ever seen before. I can't fathom how you could think that they would be well equipped to deal with that. But yeah, so ultimately, what happened in care homes, it depends who you ask. They all say completely different things. It all contradicted each other. But ultimately, the aim of the inquiry isn't as much as I think a lot of the bereaved families, and frankly, some of the journalists would like that kind of killer line where the inquiry go, you got this wrong. That doesn't come until, if it does come at all, it comes in the report at the end. At the moment, the inquiry want to understand. So although the Welsh Government's response was incredibly weak, that's not really going to be said explicitly by the inquiry in the evidence gathering. So we wait to see the report in seemingly 1,000 years, but it was really cringy to watch all of the testimony around care homes because they were trying to defend the indefensible in front of the people whose families had suffered most from it. It was a hard watch.
So whilst we're still on care homes, Will, obviously you've talked about the lack of capacity for testing, the lack of PPE, but something there was plenty of was guidance and changes in guidance for care homes. Mm-hmm. To what extent have the Welsh Government talked about the level of support they provided for institutions, not just care homes, but every public institution that had to have a new set of rules imposed on them semi-regularly, about the level of support they were providing those organisations in order to try and understand the rules and how they were changing and how that would affect themselves and, in many instances, very vulnerable people?
It was tricky, wasn't it? Because throughout the pandemic, there was no shortage of there was so much swirling about, wasn't there? Of there's this guidance, these rules. But once we got after that first initial wave, once we got through kind of May 2020, there was quite a formulaic. We all kind of got what the virus was, and we got what the risks were, and there was that clear 3-week, to quote Mark Drakeford, regular, reliable rhythm, wasn't there? But in those early periods of the pandemic, it was pretty bad especially for care homes. I remember seeing an email from a local authority to one care home saying that if you don't take people without a test, we won't give you any business in the future. It was a bit of a free for all. I mean, and this is actually why I think we need a Welsh specific inquiry, because there was lots of stuff around care homes that we haven't got into. So the Welsh Government made the decision to supply care homes directly with their they essentially had some stockpiles that they'd built up in case there'd be a flu pandemic. And in England, they gave all of that to wholesalers and said, just give this to care homes because that's the normal channel. Whereas the Welsh Government said, we're going to do this directly. And actually, that didn't work for quite a while. And so that left a lot of care homes with almost no personal protective equipment. And that is quite a niche thing, which I don't think the inquiry didn't go into. but I think should be gone into, because next time there's a pandemic, that's still going to be a problem. How do we get PPE to care homes? And if Wales is going to be responsible for this again, we need to have learnt the lesson from that. And that's, I think a really good illustration of why we need a Welsh-specific inquiry.
So with that in mind, and also with the evidence you've heard and seen with your own eyes as well, what do you make of the accusation that was levelled at Mark Drakeford during these sessions that Wales was making different decisions for the sake of it?
I don't think so. I mean, there was a few of the conversations between his special advisor and himself, the messages from his special advisor seem to be suggesting that how they portrayed their decision making should be to emphasize that these were Welsh solutions to Welsh problems. And I think they realized pretty early on, because they were being juxtaposed with Boris Johnson and just chaos, with Dominic Cummings and just, well, Boris Johnson is just chaos, isn't it? So I think because they were being juxtaposed against that, when people are very scared, they realized that if they were to just act like grown-ups, at least outwardly, that proved incredibly popular. I mean, the summer of 2020, the Welsh government, like, they were in heaven. Not only did people know they exist, but people liked what they saw. It was like their dreams come true. They'd waited 20 years for a moment like this. But there was clearly a desire for them to portray themselves as doing things differently. Whether they actually ever made decisions for the sake of being different, I actually think they did that far less than the UK government did. I think the UK government were very keen to show, not maybe do things differently to Wales, but make sure Wales couldn't do things differently to it. I mean, we heard that at several occasions. Boris Johnson admitted that he didn't want to give a perception that there was different parts of the UK doing different things. So ultimately, the Welsh government was run by politicians, and politicians are going to politic, aren't they? They're going to do things which to try and give themselves a bump in the polls to increase their popularity. But I don't think, we've got to do this to look different was at the forefront of their mind. But I think when there was an opportunity to portray themselves in the best possible light, they would do that.
Well, I mean, Mark Drakeford himself made much of this email he'd got from the Treasury, which he attempted to say showed that the UK government didn't want Wales to go any further on lockdown restrictions during the rest of, compared to the rest of the UK. What do you make of that email? Do you agree with the Baroness Hallett that she didn't agree with that assessment, did she? But Mark Drakeford was quite clear that that's what he thought.
Oh, he was so excited, wasn't he? He was so excited. He pulled his little tie up, and he was just really giddy that he thought he'd got this gotcha moment where he had gone through the documents and he had discovered it. I think that both of them went too far either way. I think Baroness Hallett was, I think, quite dismissive of this document, and Mark Drakeford thought he'd found the smoking gun in Rishi Sunak's trembling hand. And I don't know if it was either of those things. I think actually, the more I thought about this, the more. So just for context, it was essentially a memo from an email from an internal Treasury email, which seemed to imply that they don't want any of the devolved nations as a policy to stop them going further than England. And he said, well, this is a deliberate policy. But actually, Mark Drakeford doesn't really need to think about the cost of something, the financial cost, does he, when something happens? So he can say, I want to do this because this will be what's best for fighting the virus. And he actually just has to say, I'd like the money to do that. Whereas the Treasury actually has to think about, where does it get the money to do this? Where does it budget that? And I've got no doubt that the UK government could have been far more helpful at every stage of this in terms of its liaising with Welsh government. And I think you'd have rocks in your head to think that they were a helpful and engaged partner with Wales throughout it, which treated Wales like an equal decision maker in this national crisis. I don't think that's the case, but I also don't think this was the smoking gun that Mark Drakeford thought it was. My feeling was it just reflected that the Treasury has other things to think about other than Wales. And I mean, some people will say that that's an argument for things like Welsh independence or further devolution or whatever, but I think it was just a reflection of the reality that Wales was just one of many considerations of the Treasury. I know I've answered that question about 40 times in different ways.
It's fine. We'll get back. We're going to give you another opportunity to try and answer again later as well. Gary?
No, I was going to ask you about that link between UK government and Welsh government, Will, and one of the things which startled me a little bit was that when it came out, I can't remember who it was who said it, but that Welsh government didn't know anything about the UK government opening a test centre in Cardiff. was that a bit of a shock in the room if you were there?
It was a weird one, this, because we knew all of that. We knew all of that really early on in the pandemic when we were trying to set up test centres, because I contacts of mine at Public Health Wales they designed how the testing regime was going to look in Wales. They'd sorted which labs were going to be using it. They sorted the sort of test it was going to be, because some tests required a nose swab and a mouth swab, some required just a nose swab, or vice versa. And the reason Wales had taken a little bit longer was what they wanted to do is have these tests feed automatically into someone's NHS records in Wales. So they'd got that all lined up, and then contacts in Public Health Wales were saying to me, there's a testing centre that's just appeared at the Cardiff City Stadium, and it wasn't us. Like we think it's the UK government, but we don't know who's just built this. And at the time, I remember thinking that can't possibly be true, because that would be mad. That would just be bonkers. And everyone was saying to me, this is true. And I was just like, nah, I just don't believe it. And the more you looked into it, the more it was true. So when you hear it when you hear it inside the COVID inquiry, you think, it just reminds you of how ridiculous that was, that happened. And I do appreciate, I mean, we needed tests, and the UK government set up a test centre, which is, I mean, in a way, great. Thanks very much. But that also created huge problems going down the road. So in the second wave, as we went into the autumn, it essentially created two streams of testing in Wales. You had the Welsh government tests, which went to Welsh government labs and initially fed into the Welsh NHS. And then you had the UK government labs, which are the Lighthouse labs, which went to different laboratories to be tested, and then had to come in through a different way, and it was a slightly different test, and sometimes tests would get sent to the wrong place, and the Welsh government didn't control the allocation of tests to those specific test centres. So it was absolutely bananas that happened. And what was nice was Baroness Hallett's reaction was just like, what? Are you saying that they set up a test centre without telling the government of Wales they were doing it? And I was all of the civil servants are very, very polite. Oh, yes, my lady. Yes, that is what I'm telling you. It was terrible. Yes. And it was nice to see that it was ridiculous, because in my head at the time, it was like, yes, that's insane. But we knew, and that's what I meant at the start when I said, all of this is just, it reminds you just how ridiculous everything was throughout that, and how unprepared we were, and what a ridiculous settlement we have in terms of governance at the moment, with just different, like, parts of the response was just haphazardly run by a different area of. I could go on about this for ages, but anyway, yes.
Well, I was going to get you to draw out on that, actually, because that was the one which came up on my kind of news intake on it. It was about that test centre. Were there other examples where UK government was doing stuff in Wales, but Welsh governments weren't? It wasn't dovetailing up. Like, how supportive was the UK government to Wales during the pandemic?
I mean, I sat through every minute of 3 weeks of COVID inquiry, and I'll be honest with you, it has blurred a bit, because that is a lot of listening about the COVID inquiry. But I think one thing that was pretty stark was the behaviour of Simon Hart, the Secretary of State for Wales, who essentially was asking the Welsh government for explanations about areas which are essentially the Welsh government's job. I mean, personally, I think any modern Secretary of State for Wales is trying to do anything to find a reason to exist, because I don't really know what they're for, besides some kind of administrative processes. But there was no doubt that there was hostility. It was clearly two parties. I mean, a big thing was the lack of contact from Boris Johnson to Mark Drakeford. I mean, they went 2.5 months, was it, without speaking, from May until the start of August in 2020. And I think Mark Drakeford said it during that time. He said, how did he phrase it? He said, I wouldn't expect to speak to him every week, but every third week that would have been helpful, because then we could have shared ideas, and it could have been helpful for England as well as Wales. And it just seemed like a a natural, and he was very keen to praise Michael Gove. There's a bit of a love-in with Michael Gove and Mark Drakeford. Michael Gove was the person who the Welsh government would speak to. He was their point of contact. What is he? Of something of the Duchy of Lancaster. We're such a ridiculous country, aren't we? So he was speaking to Michael Gove, but he said the issue with that is Michael Gove ultimately doesn't have decision-making power. He would then be relaying it back. He wasn't a decision maker. And sometimes you need the two people at the very top to have a conversation, and it saves a lot of time. And I think the fact that they weren't willing to do that, and Boris Johnson said that the reason why he didn't want to include the devolved nations in lots of high-level meetings is because they didn't want to give the appearance that we were a quasi-federal system. The problem is we are. That's it, to ignore the lived realities of what we have on these islands. So I think I think the realities of what we live with butted up pretty heavily against what certain politicians would like us to be in terms of how we're set up. This has gone off on all kinds of tangents today. I need to dismount from this high horse.
No, well, there's so many bits and pieces, and I just throw in a question in now, which spoiled Matt's script. But I was listening to James Williams on Radio Wales interview Mark Drakeford. I think it was last week on the COVID, and it was around how Wales dealt with the very, very start of the pandemic and the Wales-Scotland rugby match. Who was going to pull it? Who wasn't? And then the stereotype. I really thought James, he didn't really deliberately spear Mark, but Mark's answers were really, I just thought they were really poor. And I remember that game, I was supposed to be going and there was confusion galore. I just don't know what you thought on that. Well, that was mentioned in the inquiry.
I mean, James Williams is very good at spearing someone, but while smiling, he's very, very disarming like that. James is brilliant. That stuff about the mass gatherings and what do we cancel mass gatherings? I think that demonstrated a huge lack of leadership from Mark Drakeford in his evidence in the inquiry in particular, because he talked about how he had been given evidence that there could be a 2% reduction in deaths if they cancelled outdoor mass gatherings. And actually, we know now that we really should have cancelled outdoor mass gatherings, but the evidence at the time was fairly limited. It was kind of 2%. I mean, 2% deaths of a lot of people is still a really good thing to try and avoid, isn't it? But he was saying about how he was in a Cobra meeting and how Mark Drakeford was saying how he'd argued vociferously against this. He'd said, no, I really think we should cancel mass gatherings because it gives a really good impression of the seriousness of the situation. We're asking people to stay home, but they can still go to Cheltenham. We should definitely cancel mass gatherings. And he said he argued it. And then he said that Boris Johnson said, Dom says no. So Dominic Cummings says no. And Mark Drakeford obviously wanted to tell that anecdote to drop in the Dom says no line. But then the natural question is, well, you could still have done that in Wales. You could still have cancelled, you could still have stopped these mass gatherings in Wales. Why didn't you? And Mark Drakeford's answer was, well, there wasn't enough evidence. How could I have justified it? And I was like, well, through the things you've literally just said. And I mean, he did make a point that, well, we didn't actually have the power to cancel that Six Nations game at the time. But they could have said to the Welsh Rugby Union, it is our strong advice that you should cancel it. And the Welsh Rugby Union would have done it immediately. But instead, what Mark Drakeford said, they said to the Welsh Rugby Union was, whatever you do, we'll back you. And that isn't leadership. That is essentially saying, I think we should do this, but I want the UK government to do this thing, which is going to be inevitably unpopular in the short term. And we saw that as well with the firebreak and the local lockdowns. So they were persevering with local lockdowns through September, the Welsh government. They knew that they had to do a firebreak. The sage advice in September was you need to go into a firebreak. And they said we were trying to get the UK government to do it as well, even though Mark Drakeford at the same point admitted that there's no way the UK government were going to do it at that point. But what they essentially wanted was the UK government to bite the bullet for them. And I can get it from a political perspective. You know, you don't want to make that tough decision. And it would make sense for the whole of the UK to do it together. But ultimately, Welsh Labour portrayed themselves ahead of the Senedd election that we handle in 2021, that we handled COVID best. We took the tough decisions to keep Wales safe. And actually, I think the evidence suggests that quite a lot of occasions, they actually didn't take it, or they didn't take it when they should have taken it. And there was a lack of leadership, and it took them a long time to realise that they had a role in this. Yeah, so that was something that struck me, about that Six Nations was they really didn't take that decision. I mean, there's a much stronger argument for cancelling the Stereophonics concert, which they didn't cancel. That was indoors, and they didn't do that. So I think there was a big lack of leadership there.
Whilst we're on the question of leadership and Mark Drakeford, don't worry, we'll get onto the other leadership stuff, but I think Kerry's going to cover that once I'm done. Do you think that Mark Drakeford's legacy, which I think has started to change in recent months, probably due to things like 20 mile an hour, but do you think the longest impact on his legacy and the longest taint on his legacy will be his failure to call the Wales-specific COVID inquiry, Will?
I think it's really hard to talk about legacies immediately after something, because I think how many politicians do we think of from the 90s and the noughties, and when they left we thought, God, they were a nightmare, and now we see them, we think, God, they're statesmen. Oh God, aren't they mature and thoughtful? And you tend to find so many politicians just become so much more likable when they haven't got to make tough choices and they can say what they think. In terms of his legacy, I think it will be forever a black mark against his name that he didn't call the Welsh-specific inquiry. I think in terms of his overall legacy, though, I just don't think in 10 years anyone's going to think it was Mark Drakeford that brought in 20 miles an hour. I just can't see people caring about it then. What I can think, I wrote a piece about it where essentially he's the guy who made Welsh politics matter for the first time to people within Wales. And whether you liked what you saw or didn't, or whether he made you feel really safe at one of the scariest times, or you felt like he was this dictator who was just drunk with power, he's easily the most recognisable First Minister Wales has ever had. How COVID was handled in Wales and how Wales has been governed has been really, for a person who's innately quite quiet, has been really dictated by his idiosyncrasies and his personality and his worldview. And I think his legacy will ultimately always be COVID. It will be the good and the bad. It will be the things we did well, the things that we could have done better, the loss of life, all of it will fall down on him. And I think it's, in terms of legacy, it will be the fact that it was the first time in Wales we realised we could do things differently, and he was kind of the face of that. And it didn't mean you liked it or disliked it, but I just can't see. I think initial unpopularity when you go, I think a lot of that disappears, and a lot of it depends on what comes next as well. Yeah, I don't think his legacy will be tainted by 20 miles an hour. I think everyone looking back will think, why didn't we have a Welsh inquiry? Why didn't we get these answers? But I don't think it will just be one of them. I think it will just be he was the COVID minister.
So my final question before I hand back over to Kerry, and this is probably one of the more difficult questions I'll ask, especially ask without the presence of a lawyer. Do you think that politics trumped public safety at points during the pandemic?
I think it depends. The problem is there's so many definitions on that. The definition of public safety. I think retrospectively, there's a really strong argument now to say, and this would have been unthinkable at the time, to say actually schools are just not closing. We have to keep schools open from maybe not public safety, but from a public good perspective. I think there's an argument for making that. But at the time, that would have been, I mean, I'd have, as a member of the media, I'd have been saying, people are dying because you are leaving these schools open. How can you not close them? But I think knowing the impact that's had on young people, I think there's an argument. I'm not arguing for or against it. But I think when you talk about public good and public harm, there's so many ways to balance it. But I do think that the decision makers, I covered Wales far more than I covered the UK, but my perception of decision makers in Wales was that they took seriously what they were trying to do, and they didn't want to cause deaths. Their priority was to keep people alive and healthy, and that was what underpinned their decision making. It's inevitable that politics plays on everything when you're a politician, isn't it? Because also you have to take people with you. You could say you could bring in a public health measure, which makes sense from a public health perspective, but if no one will follow it, then actually it doesn't do any good. So I think in the main, what underpinned decision making was a desire to keep people safe. I think that perhaps inexperience as much as anything, none of them were ready for this. Like who was really? None of us had seen it before. None of us had really knew what we were dealing with, or the gravity of the decisions people were having to make. But then again, we didn't all run for office, did we? So if you put yourself in that position, that's your job. You've stood before people and said, "I'm best placed to make your lives better." I'm also trying to answer this without being sued. No, I think it would be unfair to characterize it like that expediency was put ahead of the public good. But I do think there are times that self-evidently better decisions could have been made.
I think that's really fair, and I certainly think the Welsh politicians, I think the public here see that more than I think perhaps other areas of the UK, perhaps. And there's an awful lot of things we could talk about. I wanted to ask you about Nightingale hospitals, but we've kept you quite a long time, and it has been quite a historic week in Welsh politics. And as much as we could talk about COVID, I do want to ask you about the announcement from Saturday with a new leader for Welsh Labour, with Vaughan Gething into the hot seat. You are a serious journalist, Will. I have to do that gag. I'm going to use that an awful lot. I think that's a soundbite which will resonate for a while. What's your take on where we are following Saturday's announcement?
Well, I mean, there's so much to go, isn't there? I mean, it was incredibly close. He won with 51.7% of the vote. We've left the European Union with that kind of percentage. So some would argue it's overwhelming. You can't talk about it without talking about this donation that he received. The £200,000 donation from a company and a man that were convicted of environmental crimes repeatedly. Well, it was dumping waste in a nature reserve and then failing to clear that up. And now we know in January of this year, there was another conviction. I think the size of the donation in itself is it's enormous, isn't it? £200,000. I think it dwarfs. Well, I mean, it dwarfs Jeremy Miles. I mean, Mark Drakeford, I think he got about 15 to 20,000 when he ran. The spending limit is only 44,000, but that doesn't include staff. He had all the union backing as well, and he won by 1.7%. And most MSs wanted the other guy. I think that's a really tricky position. If Vaughan Gething was coming in to be leader and he hadn't got to deal with 20 miles an hour farming subsidies, hashtag no farmers, no food, or senior expansion, or he didn't have an NHS which was really struggling, he had a really functioning education system and an economy which was thriving, it would be tough coming in with this kind of quite small mandate. As it is, all of those things are happening, and he's come in. I think the other elements of that donation as well, the fact that on the same day that one of those donations was made, the same company put in a bid for a development which would require Welsh Government approval. The fact that during the leadership campaign, the company had to pay a fine after an employee died because of poor health and safety, because of issues in processes around their site. It's the fact that he lobbied for that company before he received the donation. Now, again, we've got to stress, and I mean, it's the only thing they have stressed, Vaughan Gething's campaign, that all of this was within the rules. But there's perceptions, aren't there? There are. I actually think the biggest issue with all of it isn't even the donation. It's not the source. It's the fact that he hasn't fronted up to it. It's the fact that anybody who's questioned it is dismissed. Well, I was an unserious journalist, wasn't I? So for deigning to ask that question, and I think that the worst thing you can be is hiding from scrutiny. And I think when you're an unelected First Minister, they didn't vote for the party when he was First Minister, and you've got a very narrow margin of victory. You need to show a bit you need to be seen to be listening. And I think that is going to be a real challenge for Welsh Labour going forward. I mean, I don't know when this pod's going to go out, but it's going to be a really interesting week ahead.
I think Rich is hoping to get it out by Thursday, which will be the 19th or 20th. So maybe we'll have cabinet, and we are going to talk about that next week. And like you mentioned there, I had a whole couple of questions around baggage.
I do want to point out, if I can, because I get absolutely slaughtered on social media most of the time. I did predict the result pretty closely, and I'm pretty smug about this. And I want to point this out because it's actually lost me any friends I have at work, because I think I had such a big grin on my face today that actually I've lost all my friends. So I might as well lose all my friends listening to this as well.
No, congratulations. I think putting those kind of they're the solar system figures at the moment, though, aren't they? But that's you've gone through the baggage, the really big baggage, which I think people are aware of. But tonight is a COVID episode. Do you think that kind of Vaughan's role in the pandemic is going to kind of be baggage he'll carry through his leadership in Wales as the inquiry continues, and I presume other aspects, other modules will look at Wales as well? Do you think that's going to be something which will follow him around now?
It's going to be a gift that keeps on giving for his opponents. I mean, it's not going to go away. You can't look at any of these modules and think, the modules of the COVID inquiry, and think, oh yeah, that's not going to involve Vaughan Gething, because it is. I mean, he made his pitch to be leader on the basis that he'd been baptized in the fire of COVID, didn't he? I mean, that was his pitch to be leader. So he can't hide from that. I wrote up his day of giving evidence, and I described his response as kind of rope-a-dope politics. Essentially, it's a bit like Muhammad Ali in the Rumble in the Jungle. You just take the blows and try and talk until your opponent just gets fatigued and just moves on. And I don't think that works when you're a first minister. I think that will be when you're any other role in government, you just don't get the same attention. You're not scrutinised in the same way. Whereas when you're the first minister, you are the person that if anyone knows anyone, they're going to know you, and you can't just wait for things to blow over. A lot of the time, you have to address it and you have to manage it well. And I think how he was during the pandemic. I mean, I spoke to a lot of the bereaved family groups outside of the inquiry, and one of them just described his testimony as word soup, and they didn't feel like they got answers. And actually, part of an inquiry is to learn lessons, but another part is for closure and scrutiny and accountability and understanding. And I don't think, you listened to Vaughan Gething's evidence and felt like you understood the decision making more. And I think if that's the mentality he takes into being First Minister, it will make his job quite a lot harder for him.
Yeah, and we don't want to go into too much on it tonight, because it is, we were hoping to focus on COVID. We felt because it was so historic, we have to talk to you while we had you on that. And will be.
I'm happy to do more COVID.
I can come back to you. I've just got one more question. Actually, we're going to round up. But if you do one more COVID, the one thing I was interested in was did the Nightingale hospitals come up much in the inquiry? Because when I've worked in the health sector, there was a few things around those which very successful, quick, and things like that. But you speak to the health sector, and an awful lot of people were unsure how they were going to be staffed and things like that. Did it get raised in this module, or is that further down the line?
I didn't hear it raised, to be honest, or in any kind of forensic detail. I think the two things that they'd want to talk about on the Nightingale hospitals is firstly funding of them and how they were paid for, but also, as you say, the issue of staffing, because quite a lot of the time with COVID, it wasn't a case of just space. It was like hospital capacity isn't just an area of volume where you can put a person, is it? It's the physical, it's things like the beds, it's the ventilators, but most importantly, it's the staff. And if half your staff are off with COVID, you could open a 20,000 bed Nightingale hospital, but if you can't staff it, it doesn't mean anything. I'm always hesitant to criticise the Welsh Government over the Nightingale hospitals, especially because they weren't used, because it's like criticising, I think, people for saying that they put lifeboats on a ship and the ship didn't sink. But I do think I would hope in a future module we'll talk about the ability to rapidly uplift our hospital's capacity would be a very useful thing to have in a future pandemic and understand. So I would hope they'd explore it, but I didn't hear much about it, and I can't pretend I've gone through the future module. I'm still trying to get through this module. I haven't gone through the future modules in enough detail to work out where they're going to appear.
Will, thank you so much for coming on and speaking to us this evening. if people don't know, you have got a wonderful newsletter that you're producing at the moment. Where can people find it?
It's the very imaginatively named Will Hayward newsletter, which I promise you I did not choose that name myself. If I had any friends left, they'd definitely be going if I called it the Will Hayward newsletter. But yeah, it's just a breakdown of what I think are the big issues happening in Welsh politics that week. Yeah, if people would subscribe, that'd be great. But I'd say subscribe to Hiraeth as well as a matter of priority.
Well, thank you, Will. If people want to hear more from you on X, where can they go?
It's at Will Hay Cardiff.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Will. And as Will said, thank you for listening to us today. You can hear more from us on all the socials at Hiraeth Pod. You can go to our website, www.walespolitics.com. You can support us not only with your ears, but with your wallets at www.patreon.com/Hiraeth Pod. And next week, live on March the 25th at 8 p.m, we will be doing a live X Space. Still can't get over not saying Twitter. The live X Space covering all the fallout from Welsh Labour leadership election, including what the new cabinet looks like and the policy landscape in a number of key policy areas. You can find that. The tweet for that space will be on our Twitter feed, on our X feed. You never know. I'm never going to get this right. But thank you so much for listening. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you for listening to Hiraeth. If you like what you heard, please don't forget to subscribe, rate and review.